This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
What's up, Andrew?
Dude, what's up?
I don't know. This week's been, as usual, just crazy. So I'm glad that it's Friday, but what's up with you?
Yeah, I'm exhausted. I'm excited, which is like the worst. Being exhausted and excited for me is like the worst place I can possibly be because it's a path to destruction. But I had to get up really early because I had an idea of how much time something was going to take me. And I realized that it had to go out at noon today. And I was like, this is going to take me 3 hours, I think. And this other thing is going to take me 2 hours. And they both need to be done. So that means that I need to be up at 5 a.m. Eastern time, which is 3 a.m. my time, which loosely translated to me getting little to no sleep, which is fine because I did get it. So we're good.
That's good. All you needed was 1 5-hour energy and you would have been fine.
Yeah, I know, right? We don't have Jason today, but it's okay because we have 2 guests.
We have another Jason.
We do. We've got it.
Yeah, we're just filling in. Jason and Caitlin, you want to introduce yourselves?
Hey, everybody. My name is Jason Meller. I'm actually the founder and CEO of a company called Kolide. We're a Ruby on Rails shop. We're hiring. And I just came back from RubyConf a few weeks ago. You may have seen me over there doing the talk on building honest software, or more importantly, how to avoid building dishonest software. But I'm here today with Caitlin, who's an employee that just started at Kolide actually this week. And I thought it would be a lot of fun. Just throw her onto a Ruby on Rails podcast her first week. But more importantly, I wanted to talk about her journey of how she actually got her job at Kolide and more around the context of what it's like to be someone who's a junior engineer. So Caitlin, I'll let you give everybody some information about yourself and your background.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name's Caitlin Cabrera. As Jason mentioned, I just started at Kolide this week on Monday. My title is Ruby Rails Programmer. So I am the newest and right now only junior. And it's just been great. And I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. We're glad to have you. And Jason, you were on, it looks like September 27th of 2019 was the last time we talked with you. So it's been a couple of years. That was, it looks like episode 53 for anybody who wants to go back and listen to that. Have you hired juniors before? And is this your first foray into it? I can't remember if we talked about it.
Yeah, so just general update on Kolide. So if you don't know Kolide, we're a company that is essentially a device security company, but instead of locking down devices, we actually message folks directly on Slack with prescriptive advice on how to actually fix the problems. Because we think it's a much better way of solving, compliance issues with devices. People, when you lock down the devices, they'll just use their personal device at home. So we try to avoid that. It's the whole premise of the product. It's built entirely on Ruby on Rails. And since we've launched it, I think it was a few months right before we did the last podcast, it's taken off like crazy. But I've been really hesitant to grow the team dramatically because there's so many problems that you can introduce by growing an engineering team too quickly. And even though we are VC backed and we just raised a big round a few months ago, I'm just super conservative when it comes to growing a team. I think every time you add a new person, it can completely change the DNA, the team dynamic. And we just want to be very intentional about that. So we're now finally at a point where we can't even justify staying the same size. So we've now really started hiring. And the reality is for us, what that meant was, writing up a job rec to find people that were at a similar skill level of Ruby on Rails, say either intermediate all the way to senior. And I tried to do my best to kind of leave room for folks that were maybe differently shaped, but certainly not explicitly seeking a junior candidate. And then Caitlin, who surprised us all, we were working with a company called Hatchways, and they're a Y Combinator company. And what their specialty is, they try to help you find candidates that you don't necessarily think to look more closely at. And they use like this whole testing regimen to do that. And we hadn't had a lot of success with it. The tests they have are very JavaScripty, and they don't really give me a good sense of whether that candidate's going to be good at Ruby on Rails in particular. But I remember seeing Caitlin's resume come across my desk, and it wasn't from this company, but we learned later that she actually started hearing about Kolide maybe through that program and then just independently applied, which was awesome. And then I got on the phone with her and I knew right away, like, if we were going to talk to someone who would be more of a junior candidate, Caitlin would be the best possible foray into that because she felt like someone who was articulate. She felt like someone who would be a great self-advocate. And we were really upfront with her and said, listen, we didn't necessarily plan on going into thinking about this. And we want to set up our organization to be where you can be successful because we think that you're going to be someone to watch and someone really important. So that was sort of the history of how Caitlin originally applied and why we moved forward with her. So now I'm kind of here heart in hand because I hear Andrew in the past has talked a lot about this on prior episodes. And it's definitely a new thing for me as well. You asked earlier, have I ever hired another junior candidate? I've been building Ruby on Rails teams since I started my career, even as a solo engineer to manager. And I've never hired someone right out of college before, especially someone who didn't have any long-term professional experience with Ruby on Rails. And Caitlin does, but I would say that this is new territory for us. And I wanted to talk about it.
Wow. I mean, so many things, right? So many places to go. So you said that you were kind of like, you were looking for mid to senior, but you kind of left that like room open. What do you think about maybe like your experience led you to like that kind of belief that maybe that someone who doesn't fit into a senior category can still have the same impact of someone with a senior paycheck?
Yeah, I think for me, it was taking stock in the people that have been successful at Kolide. I realized that just technical knowledge and experience wasn't maybe even the most important thing. It actually, for us, it's about having empathy for our customers, because what we do is we send messages to people of all different shapes and sizes and of different levels of expertise. One of the things that our program does is it can send you messages that say, hey, you have an unencrypted SSH. Let's go and fix that up and get it encrypted. We might be saying that to someone who has never, ever in their life opened the terminal, but maybe 5 months prior, someone was like helping them get set up on like GitHub based like CMS where they have to like upload stuff and they got like an SSH key set up for them. And now they need to figure all this out. And we have to explain things like the terminal, and we have to explain things like, hey, it's normal when you type in a sudo command, you're trying to type in your password, no characters appear. Like that's something we take for granted, but it's not necessarily something that someone using that for the first time would know. And so if you have a really good sense of other people and you can put themselves in your shoes, that is often a better indicator of a good outcome for an employee at Kolide than someone who's going to be the next whiz-bang engineer that's going to figure out like our next scaling hurdle. Like we need those types of people too, but more often I'm more interested in people that are going to help move our product forward. And so that was why it was really important to not necessarily close the door on people at different experience levels, because that type of empathy is actually very valuable and like a capitalistic type of value. Like I'm not saying soft value, like things that we would pay good money for to get because we don't have them anymore. That part of us has been somewhat extinguished.
I wanted people to hear that from someone in your position, because I talked to a lot of juniors who were like, I can't find a job. I love Ruby. I can't find a job. They want people with experience. I don't have experience. I definitely want to get into that later, but it's interesting. I wanted to get into a little bit more about what Caitlin was doing kind of on her end, because that's kind of where a lot of the advice that I tend to give kind of goes. But first, before I forget, because I'm going to forget this, the single most important, impactful thing that my company did for me as a junior is that they assigned me a senior as my mentor. And every single week, I met with that mentor on a weekly cadence. Maybe we talked about code. Maybe we talked about communication. Maybe we talked about code review. Maybe we talked about something else. But that one person that I knew that even if we weren't working on the same thing, no matter what, he was going to be there for me if I needed him. And since then, I've changed jobs 3 times. He's changed jobs several times. I still every single week meet with him at the same time. And I now mentor a junior myself, and I meet with him every single week. And I think there's something about that every single week, just checking in. I feel like that's really important. So if you want to really help her, I'd highly suggest doing that. But I want to move over to Caitlin and kind of talk about her journey and kind of how she got to the point where she was in this position.
Yeah. So my journey's been a little bit unconventional in some ways. So my bachelor's degree is actually in economics. I do not have a CS background from my undergrad, at least. So in 2017, I graduated from the University of Louisville, again, with that bachelor's in economics. So prior to that, I'd always had an interest in CIS, computer information systems, as well as computer science. At the time, though, I had financial aid that was major specific. So I kind of had the choice of suck it up and get this degree I realized I wasn't super interested in, or take out a ton of loans. So I did the economical thing. I went ahead and got the degree I had the financial aid for. So after I graduated, I got a job working in finance at a big company. It's somewhat infamous for not having the best culture. So that was where I worked for about 2 years before I went back to school. And this was all before COVID, of course. So it was an in-person job. And when I was there, I started noticing I was seeing a lot of turnover. And I was also seeing a lot of people who had shelled out $30,000, $45,000 for these degrees. And they're working jobs that pay $10 or $15 an hour. So that was, again, something that kind of planted the seed in my head. Like, okay, the power of a CS degree may be something I can look into here if that's something I've been interested in. And of course, I'm not saying getting a business degree is a walk in the park. It's not something you think of when you think of a quote unquote easy degree. So these are hard degrees to get. So yeah, during this time, I'm working in person. As time goes on, I'm realizing this job isn't the best fit just for a lot of reasons. And because of what I did, it was a lot of setting credit lines, doing bank statements, emailing the banks, things like that. I did listen to a lot of podcasts while I worked, and I was a big fan of Freakonomics at the time, and I still am, podcasts. So they always had folks on there who were data scientists. They had some tech folks, but what really stuck with me was that, oh my gosh, these people get paid to be creative, to learn, and to make cool things, and that's their job. How cool is that? And this was also around the time I just real casually started playing around with sites like Codecademy and Free Code Camp after work, just things like HTML, CSS, C++, like making little command line programs. You plug in a year and I can tell you if it's a leap year or not. Real basic things like that. So that's where I was at. And I'd been at my finance job probably about almost 2 years. And we got news that my partner's job had him moving from where I was at in Louisville, Kentucky to South Carolina. So it was kind of a no-brainer. I'd pack up and go with, and I'd go back to school. And that turned out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made. I started at the College of Charleston in 2019. So I started taking my prereqs in January of 2019. I did everything I could. I had to take at least 5 to get those done in 6 months. I ended up taking some online and some in person at the same time, and just like get through it so I could start that August. And it was just an awesome experience too. So I started in August of 2019. And I remember right before classes were about to start, I think it was like a month when I gotten all my grades back from my prereqs and I was cleared to go in the program. The chair of the department at the time, Dr. McCauley, she emailed me and asked, so do you want an assistantship that's basically going to pay your tuition? And I was like, yeah, I'll come in right now and sign the paperwork. So that was great. So during my master's, I actually TA'd and I taught labs to undergraduates. So I taught a lot of Python and Java to folks who have never touched a terminal before or seen a line of code. And I think that kind of just helped build on my soft skills for helping folks out. I've done lots of tutorials, lots of screenshots, a lot of stuff like that. So I really enjoy teaching and helping others. So TAing was a big hit for me. And this part still kind of misses it, if I'm being honest. So yeah. And then also that program at the College of Charleston, it's also a joint program with the Citadel Military College of South Carolina. You get to pick which one's your quote unquote home institution, but you have to take a certain amount of hours at both. I think it's 11 hours at both to get kind of like a 50-50 benefit. And it's also really beneficial too, because the Citadel is a military college. I think that's kind of where my interest in cybersecurity began to grow. For example, I had a professor who, he was an alum of the Citadel and he'd been like top ranked, like really high up in the Navy, I think like at 06. And so he actually worked at the Pentagon and drove down to Charleston once a month to teach this class. And it ran as a hybrid. I also took a lot of classes like software testing and things like that. Ruby on Rails. I actually did take a software testing using Ruby on Rails, which is really cool. I just had awesome mentorship under all my professors and it was just a great experience. And I also got to work in a research lab analyzing geochronology data too. So it was awesome. And I really enjoyed all that mentorship. And I guess that kind of brings me more up to like this year and now, really. My last semester in graduate school, I did graduate in May. So I am a recent graduate. So my last semester, I worked for a very small startup that's actually headquartered in San Francisco, but yet everyone else is located in Bali, Indonesia. So I was the only developer on really a 2-person team who was stateside, so very small. I did that and TA'd and took 3 classes my last semester and didn't sleep, but it was worth it. After graduation, I concluded that contract and started looking for things that would be a better fit full time. I did take some time to study up and get my CompTIA Security Plus, which I highly recommend. I was actually looking into DoD jobs at the time as well, but regardless of what sector, private or public you're going in, that will open a ton of doors for you. So I do recommend folks, if you're interested, go get it. So I took some time to get that and then began the job hunt this past fall and saw some things for Kolide on LinkedIn and saw that it was cybersecurity and software development, saw all of their articles on honest security and things like that, and felt just really aligned with my core values. So I applied, and usually a good rule of thumb I'd like to do is recruiters don't always check if you send an application through like Hatchways or whatever. They can't always access that. So I always apply to both. That's how I got in touch with Jason, and the rest is history.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I feel like one of the things you ended up doing as you were in school was you kind of figured out ways to get experience that could kind of cheat that whole, I learned to code, but I've never had a real job. And by like doing that contract, like you mentioned, you can kind of come to your first job and have some real experience that you can talk about. Was that helpful when you were applying?
It was so helpful, especially because these were such small teams I worked on, both for the lab and that little startup. It was a lot of, okay, put your nose to the grind and figure out how to do this because there's not a senior dev around who can mentor you right now. So it did help a lot with a lot of grit and tenacity.
And school is like typically teaching you to do stuff from scratch. But then when you're doing those, when you're actually working on a real project, like you've got existing stuff you have to manage. And that's one of those things that I think the reason why people want to hire a senior is you've had experience, you've worked on real production databases and applications and dealt with customers and whatnot. But that's like a hard thing to do before your first job. That's like the experience you get at the job. I think you did a good job there with kind of establishing yourself before you even applied in a way, as best as you can.
Yeah.
It's hard, of course. So how was the interview process from your side of things? Because I remember being super nervous, had no idea what to expect. Preparation sometimes focuses around like algorithms and all of that stuff. But then a lot of other interviews can be very opposite of that. And it really depends on like the company and stuff too. But I'm curious to hear how your interviews went.
We can deafen Jason real quick if you want to be honest.
No, I actually, and this is me being totally honest, I actually feel like my interview process with Kolide was the least stressful with all the other companies I was working with at the time. I had 2 who gave me, I'm seeing a lot of companies pivot from the typical leak code style problems to more realistic coding challenges, which I think is a good thing. We can come back to that. But I had 2 companies who gave me coding challenges and they both pretty much said, oh, it's the same one we give to our senior developers. Do what you can. So that was stressful and I don't think the best way to go about hiring. And whereas I was honest with Jason and I told him, hey, I have a couple of coding challenges going on right now, but honestly, you were number 1 for my picks and we were able to work something out. So that was awesome. So in that way, it made things a lot smoother and they were extremely efficient and quick with their correspondence. So it just really, I was more put at ease there for sure.
I'd love to give you some insight though on what we were thinking and doing at the same time, because I remember immediately getting off our initial call where I interviewed you, because I do all of the initial meetings for every single Rails engineer that we meet, because I think culture fit is the most important thing. And the technical stuff is really something that can be fleshed out afterwards. And also the engineers getting to meet someone who's already been vetted culturally, I think takes a lot of pressure off of them when they're kind of doing the final interview. So our interview is really a 3 process one. It's meeting me, doing a technical challenge, and then which is take home. And then the final step is talking with some of our other engineers about that challenge, but more importantly, giving them an opportunity to learn more about what it's like to work at Kolide without me being present on the call. So when I met with Caitlin, I mean, you could just tell just how she is on this podcast. Like it's a no-brainer. We have to figure something out to make this work. So I immediately got together with our entire team because this is one of those decisions where it shouldn't just come from the CEO. bringing on a junior candidate to actually being a junior engineer at the company is a really big deal and it affects everybody. And we have to all be in agreement to be up for that challenge, or we shouldn't do it and we should let her find an opportunity that's going to be a better fit for her. So that was really important to me, that we sat down and we, at least using the resources that we had at the time, determined whether or not we were even in a position to make her successful, what that really meant in terms of our time and the things that we would need to do. And the immediate thing that came up was the assessment. Because right now, our technical assessment is something I'm really opinionated about. I hate technical assessments where you have these very abstract whiteboard-esque problems, or they're using like these very regimented time-based software stacks. And you end up in a position where you're really stressing out the candidate and you're having them do work that's really not representative of the work that they're going to see. But at the same time, I don't like building technical assessments that make them do the real work as well, because that feels unethical. Like I'm not going to give them work that I would normally pay someone for at the same time. So where we landed at that at Kolide, and we did to all of our Rails engineer candidates, is we have like this funny, I think it's called like Feline Snooker League, where it's like basically a fake app, and it was built like by a quote unquote contractor that didn't know what they were doing. And then they have to go in and kind of fix it up. It's really an exercise to help test the candidate's knowledge in just Rails idioms. If you can come into Kolide with knowing as an intermediate or advanced or senior engineer with understanding at least Rails idioms, we think that we can get you across the finish line any other way. We didn't think that was the right assessment to give to Caitlin, because even though she did say that she had prior experience with Ruby on Rails, it was important to me that we didn't give her an exercise that if she did poorly on, we wouldn't be like, well, it's okay. Like when you give someone an assessment, it's really important. That assessment is actually measuring something. And if you get a bad result from that assessment and then you move forward anyway, then what is the point of the assessment? Like it just feels broken. And so what we did was we quickly adapted another assessment for a different job that we have at Kolide, which is the endpoint specialist role. And that job is really all around writing the queries that we need to run to get the data off the endpoint that we need to build our recommendations. And it requires someone who knows SQL. It requires someone who's good at writing, and it requires someone who understands and has empathy for end users. And it doesn't really try to test their web development expertise. So we actually modified that a little bit to give it a little bit more of a web dev flavor to it. And then we sent it off to her because we felt like that was going to be a much fairer assessment. And if she did poorly on it, that would actually be good signal to us that we shouldn't move forward. But if she crushed it, then we would feel even more confident in the decision. That was really important to us, that it was meaningful and that she felt it was meaningful and it was going to be a good assessment and fair assessment of her skills. So we did that. And then she went off and did it, and it was incredible. What we got back was great. And then I wasn't present for the final round interview because I never am. So I don't have insight into how that went, but that's sort of what our philosophy is, just around testing technical skill. And by the way, the other thing that we care about a lot is giving it as an offline exercise. And we don't want to spend more than a few hours on it. That's not because it's time, but because we don't really think it's fair to have anyone spend more than 2 or 3 hours on the exercise anyway. And we don't like the pressure of being on the phone and answering questions against code that you can't physically see and play with. So that to me feels like the fairest assessment. And we give it to every single person to make it as fair as possible. Like we don't let certain people skip or anything like that. Everybody has to get it, even if you're in a position where maybe it wouldn't be necessary. You still do it anyway out of fairness.
So something that I don't hear talked about a lot is like what makes up like a good interview. Because we talk a lot about bad interviews, but when we talk about bad interviews, we're talking about people who've been through them and now know. But for the juniors going through them, if they're in a really bad interview, like that's usually like a major red flag kind of about the company, the culture, who's leading it, yada, yada. I'm making assumptions I know, but sue me, I don't care. They're probably true. But like this idea of what makes a good interview, and more seniors talking about this is what a good interview looks like, is like something I feel like maybe as a community we should be talking about more.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm curious because I'm coming up from the perspective, I've been a part of really bad interviews. I actually learned a very adversarial style of interviewing when I did management training in one of my first jobs at GE. I really hated it. It's like designed to stress the candidate out, and you have 1,000 people in the room And my first interview at GE, they actually asked me this question. There was two of us that were interviewing for this. It's called this IMLP program. At the time, it was like the elite management program for IT professionals. Now it's whatever. But anyway, it was me and then another person I knew from my University of Connecticut. And they said to me in the interview, said, hey, we've narrowed it down to just you two. And why should we pick you over him? And they actually made me throw him under the bus. And I actually did it. And it's something that like scarred me in a way that I still think about. I'm telling that story right now. And they're like, good, you're evil like us. Come join the party. And I remember thinking like, wow, I can't believe I was willing to do that. Like someone that maybe was equally suited to the job and just threw them under the bus in that moment of right after the economy collapsed and everybody was like buying for anything that they could get. But man, I did not like that about myself, learning that. And the fact that I had to then now learn that technique and apply it to others. I think that's what makes me a good interviewer today is I know the worst possible scenario. And that was kind of where that came from. But yeah, Caitlin, I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of the experiences you had that weren't like Kolide? And what are the ways that one could learn to avoid those or bail out of them quickly?
Yeah. So I think just like anything else, I think interviewing is a skill. And I do think as you do more interviews and you get in front of more people, developing the ability to really feel out their culture is super important because you can ask them all the questions you want about company culture and what it's like, but sometimes you won't always get a straightforward answer. For example, I had one company I interviewed with and it was same final round. I got to meet the team and I asked one team member what they liked about the company. And two other ones just started cackling and cracking up and saying, this is the best place to work ever. Very sarcastically, of course. That scared me a little bit. And that was when I definitely passed up on things like that. Just learn to look for the little red flags. Also for in-person stuff, my first company right out of undergrad, I walked in there for the in-person interview and I will never forget this. The air just felt so heavy. It just felt so heavy and tense on that floor. And of course, I ended up taking that job. I was young at the time and I should have known different, but I didn't. So those are some of the red flags to definitely look out for. You can really feel, just take a moment to read the room. If it's a Zoom room, in-person room, whatever, take a moment to really analyze how are people acting? What are some mannerisms I need to be paying attention to right now?
Someone one time gave me a code interview and they gave me the code base and I was looking at it. And I was thinking about it and they were like, and we want you to specifically use a couple of these specific gems. And I was like, yeah, maybe I don't want to work at this company. You know, I know it's hard when you're in that position because you're like, I need a job. I need to eat. But at the same time, it's like sometimes these companies, the ones that are making you work the hardest are actually the shittiest ones. This is a gross generalization that may not be true, but it almost seems like the experience that you get when you interview with people where the founders are developers or former developers is drastically different. And I know like in some ways the tech industry is more forward thinking. And I'm wondering if that's a thing and if that we're like kind of pushing forward. But at the same time, I don't think we are because I see on the other end of the tech spectrum, like this gross abuses of, you know, what they're doing to people in these interviews. Like if all the interviews you had, were any of them good? Or do you now look back on them and be like, yeah, if I had wound up there, like I might have probably would have been miserable.
Yeah, I've had a couple other offers that came through. So actually two of them were DoD and just the culture and everything. It seemed very churn and burn. A lot of temp devs, folks who would just come in for a year and a half and then move on. Of course, if you're familiar with any of the DoD processes, a lot of them are filled by staffing agencies. So this is not uncommon. As far as looking at culture, things seemed, I was told for one, yes, we have an official mentorship process. And then I was kind of investigating further. It turns out they didn't quite have that in place. And then of course, asking about code and things like that. Just make sure if you're wanting to work on something that's more cutting edge, more relevant, has a impact on society, aligns with your values, that you're asking those questions because that is just as important as the code you're working on in the culture. So there were some things like that personally I didn't line up with. A lot of those are why I already ended up choosing Kolide. There was just a lot of green flags there. And I was like, okay, this sounds awesome. Let's go.
Yes. I'm not getting into specifics, but there's no worse feeling than going to a company and then later finding out that it's like, oh, well, they're doing these things that I disagree with, you know, and like, that's the worst. And you're right that being a good interviewer takes skill. And that's why I always encourage you. I'm like, it doesn't matter if it's a senior, just try, because like, just go interview. If you're listening to this podcast, then who's making sure that your application is running correctly? Is the app up? Are bugs plaguing your users? Do your cron jobs execute correctly? I don't have to worry about this because I have a secret weapon, Honey Badger. Honey Badger works with my unique workflow, is easy to set up on all my projects, and gives me peace of mind throughout the day. The best part is that Honey Badger has all the tools I need in an easy to understand UI with excellent documentation. I want to build features, not waste time trying to configure my tools, and Honey Badger provides that for me out of the box. Sign up for Honey Badger today and let them know we sent you. Thanks to Honey Badger for their continued support of the show. And I was trying to look for it and I can't find it, but there is a platform out there. And what they do is they basically hold mock interviews for juniors, but it's from developers at like companies like Shopify. So like this company, like they work with developers from Shopify and, you know, like all the Fangs and the whatever, the Metas and whatever. And they get them to come in and like basically help teach and like mentor people through code interviews. So if you're bad at interviewing, there's ways to get help.
And I'll say just from the management side, the way that the power dynamic has really shifted in the last year and a half towards the prospective employee, away from the employer. It's really important that employers really learn a style of interviewing where they get what they need out of the process. But for the majority of the process, they're really selling the opportunity, because every candidate that they're likely talking to, if we're talking about STEM careers and engineers and software engineers, they're going to have many options in front of them. And that even includes junior candidates. So it's really important that you save at least 50% of the process for them to learn about you. And the onus is on you as the interviewer and as the manager or the owner or the entrepreneur to get what you can get from that process without it feeling like this sort of interrogation. Because at the end of the day, you have to make a judgment call with the data that you have. And you need to be able to get that. And a lot of people, when I do my culture fit sort of initial interview, a lot of it is me just letting them ask me questions, because a lot of the folks, they have very specific things that they want. It's probably more efficient if we can get to those things. And the other thing that I would say is it's really important to be transparent about the state of your business, especially as a startup. Some of the best candidates asked me about the health of our business, specifically like financial numbers, asked me about the fundraise that we did, who our investors are. I thought that was great because it showed that they cared enough about it that they wanted to make sure that they were de-risking as much of the opportunity as possible. And as a CEO, I love hearing those types of questions because it shows interest in the overall business, which is something that we want to see. And it also shows that they did the research because they know what questions to ask. So even though they're asking me these very intense questions, I would implore other CEOs or managers out there to be transparent and open, because I think you'll get the best candidates that way. And then also use it as a positive green signal that that person is likely going to be a good fit, because they're asking questions because they want to have the best outcome for themselves. That means they're going to be working, having that same degree of diligence when they work for you. So it's super important. Don't hold any cards close to the table. It's really not worth it at this point, and you're not gaining anything from it other than putting people off and getting them to start feeling cagey about the whole opportunity.
Are there some things kind of along that vein that you have experienced in interviews as the interviewer that you're like, okay, wow, this person, because of this, they're not, that's it. Not obviously like there's certain things you would say, obviously, that would throw that. But I'm saying like, are there things that like, I'm looking for like things that juniors can do better in interviews, things that they should avoid doing, big slip-ups you see a lot, anything like that. The bigger last question I have is that I don't have experience. These companies want experience. How do I get experience? It kind of all ties into this.
Yeah, I think that as an interviewer, my biggest challenge right now is really navigating these boot camps and understanding, because I think that what I'm having trouble with is I think the boot camps have done a really good job of creating almost these fake personas that these engineers come in with. And instead of I'm meeting an authentic person, I'm meeting someone that was obviously coached to not be themselves. And that comes across immediately to someone like me who's really trying to bring as much emotional IQ into the interview. Like, if it's clear that you're not someone who's psyched about open source, that's cool. You can still work at Kolide. But if you try to put up a front where you're trying to make it seem like that's like your thing because that's going to give you some kind of edge. That I think it reads more obvious that's the case. There's like, because I came into this, like we hadn't hired before. Caitlin and the employee that we hired before this, Hunter, since 2018, new engineer. So like the bootcamp thing has really exploded since then. And it took me all but maybe one or two interviews to really understand the game plan that they apply to every single person that goes through those boot camps and how they prepare their LinkedIn profiles, how they prepare their give out readmes and their Twitter profiles. And a lot of it feels very inauthentic. And there's no bigger turnoff to me than that. I'm totally cool if you don't spend every waking hour thinking about software. In fact, that might be a positive because it's signaling me that you're going to have good work-life balance. You're not going to burn out. I really get turned off from the whole idea of someone trying to build up a persona for me because they think that I'll like them more. Like, I just want to meet you. So I think that's, at least for companies like Kolide and me specifically, I think that's the biggest thing I've seen since we last interviewed. And it really bugs me. And it's something where I can't get over it. It's hard for me to get over it. I think boot camps are great. I think be honest about who you are and don't necessarily change who you are for the benefit of the interviewer.
Yeah, it's interesting because like colleges, I don't feel like put enough effort into helping you get a job after you go through 4 years of work. But then the boot camps kind of go the opposite and they only focus on that and getting you a job. And it's kind of like they've gone from one end of the pendulum to the other or whatever. And it's kind of like, we need something a bit more in between.
Here's something I didn't know about the boot camps. Many of them, there's two different types, it seems, that I've seen. There's these smaller, very intense, over a several month period boot camps. And then there's these longer, almost university-like boot camps. What's interesting about the longer ones is some of them help the student finance it by actually dipping into their salary after they start. So they actually say, all right, you promised us some percentage of your salary. I think that's really hard for someone like me who's trying to offer a fair salary to someone who's going to need to live off of that, not knowing that piece of information. Like, that feels weird. I would say to anyone out there who's thinking about some of those long-term financial things, I know that it's hard to potentially afford these things and that may be the only way to do it. But as an employer, that might be something I would even want to hear because I might even adjust salary upward to compensate for that because I just don't feel good about that. And I'd rather have the candidate get the 100% of the benefit that I think they should be getting versus going off to this company that maybe they've earned that money, but still it's information that I would like to have as someone who wants to help.
Oh, and some of them are, I mean, it's their bottom line, right? So if you are trying to find a job as a Ruby developer, not finding one, they'll actually be like, well, maybe you should just write React instead. The fact that they're like literally trying to push you away for their bottom line. But Caitlin, if you had to say something to the juniors out there looking for a job where you were a few months ago, some advice, some words of wisdom, what do you think that would be?
Yeah. So my undergrads actually used to ask me this all the time. I feel like I have a better perspective now. Learn how to use Git. That's my number one. Also, really important things like your soft skills, your ability to empathize and connect with people. Don't underestimate those. I spent my undergrad years bartending and waitressing, and I worked in a nonprofit, which was a ton of public speaking. And those skills have helped me out tremendously in my engineering jobs. I would also say ask questions of people who are older and smarter than you. Some of your professors, a lot of mine at least, had industry experience. People love to talk about themselves and how they got where they are. So it's always great. Get in front of them and ask questions, network, really reach out. And of course, as long as you're working hard and you're passionate and you have a smile on your face, really the sky's the limit. That's pretty much my little spiel.
Yeah. I mean, emphasize on the communication because I mean, it's going to come across, but you were like incredibly well spoken and we're probably going to start a podcast, you and me together after this, but it's important. And like, you know, the boot camp, or not just the boot camps, colleges too, like they don't teach you how to socialize or interview or whatever. I mean, I went to a 4-year university, computer science degree. I would give it back if I could. I don't even know where it is. There's so much to software that is not just coding, that is so much more important, which they don't teach you in college. Until my last year, when my almost 80-year-old former product manager for the Army, Navy, he's like, yeah, man, you guys think you're going to be coding all day? You guys are idiots. And that's when my outlook shifted dramatically. But he was right. He was so correct that writing code is one aspect of my job. But the ways that I am effective as a team member goes so far outside of that. And it's like those pieces where people with less coding experience can shine and get that position if they do have it. Because senior developers know this, like people are teachable. I'd rather have a developer with an attitude who knows how to learn, is willing to learn, than like some senior dev who's already got like some opinion about RuboCop that I disagree with. So it's like these types of developers, especially people I also find that are like second career developers, which you kind of are like also like a little bit of ahead than people who just come out of a boot camp with no other experience, because, you know, that other working experience, it makes them more mature. Because I came out of college and not mature, still not. But like the developers that I meet that come out of the boot camps who are older or not second job, they're a lot more mature. And I think if you are in that position, you should lean into that background, because I think a lot of them discount it. But like as someone who has interviewed people, who does interviews and things like that, there's like something to that. There's a genuineness that comes out about that person, because at the end of the day, I want to know how you think. I don't really care if you can write the best code in the world, as long as you're a good thinker, right? Being able to demonstrate that is so hard.
So one question I had for you, Jason, was we've talked a lot about the hiring aspect and getting your job as a junior, but as the employer, I think a lot of companies don't have any idea, okay, we hired a junior, we just let him loose, or like, what do we do? So I'm curious to hear, what is your strategy on basically making sure that Caitlin is well supported and can get questions answered and basically just absorb everything she can to, you know, flourish there.
Also, and how are you making sure that like the developers on your team aren't somehow putting them in a position of putting her down? Because I had an experience as a junior, I'll never forget it, and I hate this guy. I truly mean that, where he made me feel more stupid than I'd ever felt in my entire life. And I'll never forget that feeling. So there's an accountability level that upper management has to have with the developers of making sure there's not like an asshole culture. Not that I think that you'll have that. It sounds like you don't at all, but like that's something else that I'm always.
Yeah, I think that I almost feel like it's tone of concern from both of you. It's like, Caitlin's really special. Don't screw this up, Jason. And I read you loud and clear on that. And I came into this with a lot of hesitancy on, I just didn't want to have her have a bad experience at Kolide. But when I think about any engineer that starts at Kolide, junior or not, it's really important that their first week, especially the first day, they have an opportunity to get something productive done and they feel that momentum and that win behind them. So on her first day, I sat down with Caitlin over Zoom or Pop or whatever we used, and we got her set up. And I had several issues already ready so that she could get a quick win. One of them was the Google signage gem from Basecamp. I had a private fork of it because it wasn't ready for Rails 7. We're on Rails 7 now. And it just so happened the weekend prior, like DHH merged my pull request and then cut a new release. So that's like a really simple one, but we don't like to have private forks in our gem file if we can help it. And that's like a quick one-line change that we can show her that she can do it on her own. And then she can understand what our entire process is for putting up a pull request, the approval process, merging it herself, and then having it automatically go to production. And Heroku is what we use for production. It's a continuous deployment sort of model. So she got to see that all really within the first half of her first day. And then it's about layering things on top of that are a mixture of smaller bug fixes to things that, with each one of these things, it's about getting her more introduced to either a concept, the domain concept in the app, or in her case as well, into a Ruby on Rails idiom, but also how putting her in a position where she's shipping something that's valuable that she can point to in the app that says, I did this, and this is now helping a customer. And then while we're going through that, giving her supplemental material on Slack about why, because we use BEM style CSS syntax, and that's getting a little bit old school now, but it's one of those things that we still use. So here's the documentation for it, and here's a front end ticket that can get done with the skill set that you have today. And then also making sure that she has meetings scheduled with everybody else so that they can start bonding and getting that trust batteries filled up. And then not holding back, taking it easy, but also being very aware of how you come off in your first few pull requests. So trying to like not necessarily misrepresent how you do them, but also being aware of this is the first time getting any real structured feedback, either from me or from the rest of the team, and making sure the team is aware of that and, what my expectations are in terms of how we're going to handle those interactions. It's really hard when it's a remote team because we're all remote. It's over Slack. It's ripe for an opportunity to have misunderstandings through miscommunications. So it's something that I'm generally watching with an eagle eye. And it's hard for me too, because I'm going through this whole thing now where I'm a CEO who codes as an organization that's growing, and I can't code as much anymore. And I can't be the engineering manager as much anymore. And so I'm trying to create a contingency plan for that at the same time. But I think that plan is going to get us to at least a place where I'm going to run out of ideas. And then essentially we're going to be in a place where Caitlin can help us. Because one of the reasons why we felt good about hiring her is that it was clear that she was going to be a strong self-advocate. And her experience at Kolide isn't going to be perfect. And in fact, she can actually lay the groundwork for another junior to come in the future who isn't a great self-advocate to have a great experience. So that's sort of my expectation of her. And she's already started by helping out write some of the documentation for how to even do all the things that I walked her through on her first day. This is all like institutional knowledge that's locked up in a lot of seniors' heads. And having her be the person that ushers it into written, codified documentation that other junior or new starters can use is, I think, a great use of her time. And it actually massively benefits our company. That's my plan. And I think it's going okay. I think there's already things that I've identified that need to be going better. But I think that we're at least in a place where we are willing to learn from how this experience goes.
One thing that you made me think about was when you were talking about pairing with her is that, as a senior/mid-level developer, I pair with juniors a lot. And something that is easy to forget is that when you're pairing with a junior, typically the junior's driving, because as the senior, you're like, oh, well, I want to make sure they're doing it right. But don't forget how exhausting that is. They're pairing all the time. They're in a brand new code base. They're doing this, they're doing that. They're all over the place. There is a lot of value, I think, in being doing more of a popcorn approach at times, or just being mindful of she's been banging on this code. We've been on this call for 3 hours. Maybe it would be cool if I took over, because there's also a ton of learning opportunity that can be had by you taking over because of your speed that she can also follow on. This is for everyone, because this is something I find myself doing a lot more, is more like a popcorn approach that Steph Carey talks about on the Bike Shed podcast.
Totally. And that actually happened on our first call with Caitlin, as I actually was having her drive. And then I got the sense, she didn't necessarily say this, but I was like, wow, I could see how, because I thought back to how I learned Ruby on Rails. The way I learned it was really unique. I was working at GE at the time, and then there was this other engineer who was helping me build something, and we just happened to sit next to each other, and we sat down and collabed. And I didn't know anything about writing Ruby on Rails, any PHP, and I was a coder, but I was never a self-described developer. I just watched him build this Rails application from the ground up. And then the thing that was so valuable to me was watching him solve the problems that nobody talks about. The things that you would never write a blog post about because they feel kind of yucky, but you do them anyway, like put statements, mapping over things in the console, and using string interpolation and things like that. And then even the little things like hitting Command S a million times from an OCD perspective, because you just do it. And how he would copy and paste things instead of retyping them. All these little tiny things that made him more efficient or more reliable as an engineer that you would never know unless you sat down and watched someone do it. And I realized that would be really valuable for Caleb. So we spent a little time me driving, and then also I had to go, and then I left her with some things to do on top of the thing that I did. So that's, I think, gone pretty well, but I think that's really good advice and something that we already hit for sure.
Right. Yeah. Now, there's also I find when I am pairing when I'm driving, it's not so much the code I'm writing, but some of the things I'm doing it, how I'm doing it. My editor does this thing that their editor doesn't do. And, I have this tool that I hit a button and it pops up and it has all the Rails documentation and this and that. Right. So there's a lot of value there. When I joined the company I returned to now, but was joined out of college, the two guys that I worked with in the office, they were obsessed with they really liked their setups. They helped me get my setup all decked out. And I was really proud of it back then. So if you're working with juniors, don't forget, there's the things you're doing, but then there's the way you're doing them. And sometimes those can also really elevate their workflows as well. Cool. Well, we're almost out of time, but we're going to hit it anyway. Jason, you brought up ADHD, and as a monkey, I was like, oh, that's my word. So we have to talk about it.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about this today, and we definitely don't have enough time to like do it real justice, but this kind of goes back to what we're really good at Kolide, which is we do these recommendations. But the way that we get these recommendations out is we need to really understand at a deep level what's happening on the operating system. And I found that one of the most successful things that we do at Kolide is we go deep into the OS, and we understand it at this level that hasn't even been documented by anyone. And I noticed that the people in the organization that are the best at that are people like me that have ADHD. And I saw a tweet recently by Yehuda Katz, who also talked about this because I think he said he had ADHD. He talked about how one of the things that is interesting about folks who have it is they get distracted and they don't necessarily know the thing they're distracted by is going to be create a high value outcome or not. And that's certainly the case at Kolide, where we suddenly are like, oh, I think there's a new way to figure out if screen lock is enabled on Mac OS, but I need to reverse engineer all this code. Is that worth it? It's those types of exercises where it's not a roadmap, it's not an issue tracker, but we give people the space to be able to do those types of explorations, but they end up working out well. And I realized that hiring people that are neurotypical, you're not going to be in a position where you can maybe get those same types of outcomes because it ends up on a roadmap and you end up in situations where they apply like a normal amount of time to it and then they don't get anywhere. But then you have someone who maybe has a different perspective because of it, maybe a disorder that they have, but they actually end up being successful. And it made me think more about what are the ways that as a manager, I can make people specifically with ADHD more successful. What are the ways that I'm already doing that today? I don't even realize it because I have the disorder. And one of the things that I realized that I was doing with folks that I either perceived to have ADHD or actually have told me that they have it is even the way that I assign work. I like to be a peer among the rest of the team, even though I'm not. I'm the CEO, I'm their boss, but I like to be alongside them. It's like a management style that I always was fond of when I was a junior or an intern or whatever. So the boss was there. If I wasn't doing the work, they were going to sit down and they're going to do it anyway. And that felt like very genuine to me. And so I conduct myself. So when I ask people to do things like Kolide, there's folks that I assign work to because that's how they like to get work prescribed to them. And then there are folks that I ask for help. And that's my way of getting them to move on something. It's about me coming to them with a problem that I'm experiencing and then telling them that I really need your help on this. And what I found is with folks that I think have ADHD is that they respond, they almost see that as a welcome distraction that they can actually dive into versus really being regimented about deadlines and well, I need this by then. And it's really your responsibility to get this done. Often ADHD cohabitates with a desire to push back on any strong orders like a defiance, operational defiant disorder. And you don't want to necessarily activate that. And you want to be in a position where you actually, you give them stuff to help you with. And that's something that's always worked well for me. And I found that I naturally do that because that's how I want to be spoken to in more of a helpful context. And that's like the one hack, if we had time to share it, is as a manager is to approach it that way. I think you'll have a lot more successful outcomes.
I am so defiant. It's ridiculous. And I know that about myself and I actively avoid getting in those situations. But someone described me to a new developer the other day. They were like, well, Andrew has about 3 breakdowns a day. And they're not breakdowns. They're like, I get very excited. And it comes across in different ways. Going back to the assigning different work, if you assign me a story that's going to take 4 or 5 days and there's a lot of unknowns, it's not going to get done for a long time. But at the same time, I could knock out 10 to 20 small things in that time. So it's like the smaller the thing, the smaller the scope, the faster I can do it, even if that I can get them stacked up. But if it's one big thing, which is just extends to all different areas of my life that is making me mildly anxious right now, can't do it. I'm like, nah, I'm good. Or I get defiant about it and push back, or I'm like, whatever. But yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up of thinking about how to maximize the people who have like certain neurotypical things, how to maximize how they work.
And it's something that you still have to apply your own judgment to. It's not like, oh, they have ADHD, so you're going to treat them a different way. It's about kind of being a manager and meeting someone halfway to the work style that they are sort of signaling you that you have. And if they end up not doing well, it's your fault. It's not their fault in many ways, because there are benefits to be had with someone who isn't neurotypical. And I think that as a company, Kolide, our whole premise of our product is getting people to do things that they just want to do. Like, we have to apply a lot of UX things to make people listen to the alerts that we have. And certainly many of them are going to have ADHD, and they're going to have maybe other disorders as well. It's important that we not only use these in terms of dealing with each other, but we can apply them systematically, codify those techniques into our own product. So that's like super important. And one of the ththings that we should make sure that we do. The other thing with ADHD that I think is like super important to me is, I don't know, I've always felt that you want to create an organization where the people that are very organized can do well, but the folks that really struggle with, and they have that one meeting in the middle of the day, and so they're not going to do anything before that. And then they have the 3 hours after that meeting that they need to unwind from it. So like, I purposely have created an organization that tries to minimize the amount of meetings as much as possible, so that you just look at your calendar Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they just look like basically free and clear. And I also implore people who don't have ADHD that are in management positions, that are PMs or product owners, to try to create a lot of availability in the staff that you have. Because if they have availability, that's where the creativity can come out. They start working on things that they see on the ground being the most important, and you actually get a lot of signal from that. And try not to prescribe too much process to how things go. Like, if I see too many forms, like I can't even use Jira. We use GitHub because I can't even handle the amount of fields that I would need to fill out to even get a Jira ticket to submit successfully. And we have labels in GitHub, and I'm like, I don't even care if you submit an issue that has no labels. It's 3 words that are barely coherent, but they maybe communicate some idea. That's all it takes to submit an issue in our issue tracker. Because I know that any more than that, someone like me wouldn't be in a position where they would even be able to do it. And so like, I think that's really important, is that I got a lot of that insight for free because I have the disorder. But if you're a manager that doesn't have it and you can't relate to that, you should do these things anyway, because you'll get more out of the people that you have already. It's very likely that you have many people working for you that have this disorder. It's very common. And you'll end up creating a scenario where you get a lot more value for it by just minimizing process as much as you can.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for coming on the show. It was great to have you. And I just want to say that in all the time I've been podcasting, there's never been ever a manager who was like, hey, can I bring my new developer with me? And I just want you to know that I really respect that. And that says a lot about you as a person and as a leader, that you're doing that. And I wish more people would do it. Yeah, you sound like a great boss. I'm excited to see what y'all do in the future with Kolide. Is there anything y'all want to shout out? Anything left y'all want to say?
I'll just say that we're still hiring. So hit us up at kolide.com/careers. Looking for Ruby on Rails engineers, but also other types of engineers, endpoint, things like that. If you think that Kolide sounds like a great place to work, you should definitely contact us and we can figure that out together. That's all I have to plug, is that we're just growing really fast and we need as much help as we can to get this thing. It's really important to me personally to build honest software, and security as an industry isn't one that necessarily defaults to honesty and transparency. We're doing something that's really important, and I need really smart people to come in and help me make it happen. So if you're one of those people listening that you think that you agree with that, and you read our manifesto at honest.security, that's the full URL, and you're like, I want to make this happen, hit us up. We have a lot of money now from VC because they believe in it too. And I think we can maybe change a lot of conditions for people that are working right now in a really positive way.
I don't normally do this, but I'm going to have to hit it with a stamp. I think y'all should go apply if you're listening to this. This sounds like a good opportunity.
Definitely. And yeah, thank you both for being on, but especially you, Caitlin. Being on a podcast your first week is not very typical of a junior development job. So
it says so much about you as like a person. I already know you're going to do great things, so I'm excited.
Yes.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it. This has been awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure this won't be our last time interacting. So Jason, Caitlin, it's so great to have you guys on the show. We missed our other Jason, but hopefully we'll have him back next week.
And I just want to say, come back and do a follow-up in 6 months or a year or something, because I think it would be really interesting to see the progression and everything that how did all this work out in the end and stuff. I think it'd be fascinating.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
100% signed up.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll talk to you guys soon.